My name is Maya Ashford. I'm 36 years old, and I found out my brother had a felony record before I found out my son needed a second surgery because the same phone call delivered both of those sentences 4 minutes apart. I want you to sit with that for a second because it took me a long time to sit with it myself. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet people finally say the things that took years to say, and families learn what accountability actually costs. If stories like this tend to find you at the right time, drop a comment below and subscribe, because I have a feeling some of you already know exactly what kind of family builds a fundraiser out of a child's illness. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what my family calls love and what I eventually learned to call evidence. I'm a claims auditor for a regional insurance carrier out of Charlotte, 14 years in the job. My entire career is built on one skill, and it's a boring one. I read a document on page 1, and I read the same document on page 3, and I notice when the two pages don't agree with each other. That's it. That's the whole talent. Insurance companies pay well for people who can hold two versions of the truth in their head at once and tell you calmly which one is lying. I've always assumed that made me useful to the people around me. I did not yet understand that it would also make me dangerous to my own family, because my own family had been running two versions of the truth for longer than I'd been alive, and I was the only one in the house who'd ever been trained to catch it. I grew up the fixer. My brother Trevor is 2 years older than me, and from the time I was maybe 8 years old, there was a shape to our house that never changed. Trevor announced things. I handled things. My mother, Carol, managed the difference between the two. The way a stage manager manages the gap between what the audience sees and what's actually happening backstage. When Trevor forgot to pay a parking ticket in college, I found the paperwork and mailed the check before it went to collections, and nobody ever thanked me because in our family, handling things quietly was not a favor. It was simply what daughters did. When our father left when I was 11, it was Trevor who got taken out for ice cream by every aunt in a 50-mile radius because everyone agreed the boy needed extra care. And it was me who sat with my mother at the kitchen table while she went through the divorce paperwork, line by line, circling numbers, because even at 11, apparently, I had the temperament for it. I want to be honest and tell you I didn't resent it back then. I thought it meant I was trusted. I didn't understand yet that being trusted with the paperwork and being loved were two completely different currencies in that house, and my family had decided a long time ago which one they were willing to spend on me. I remember one specific afternoon, I must have been 13, when Trevor wrecked my mother's car, backing it out of the driveway into a neighbor's mailbox. He'd taken it without asking, which back then counted as a very big deal in our house. I watched my mother stand in the driveway with her hands on her hips, and I braced for the version of her voice I knew was coming, the sharp one, the one reserved for me whenever I so much as left a dish in the sink overnight. Instead, she sighed and she said, "Well, boys don't always think before they act, do they?" And she patted his shoulder and told him to go wash up before dinner. I was the one who called the neighbor, apologized on the phone in my 13-year-old voice, and arranged for the mailbox to be replaced out of my own babysitting money because somebody in that house needed to handle it, and it had already been decided, long before I was old enough to have a say in the matter, exactly which one of us that somebody would always be. I don't tell you this because I think it's dramatic. I tell you this because it's the exact shape of everything that came later, just smaller and with a mailbox instead of $60,000. By the time I was in my 20s, the pattern had a name in my own head, even if I never said it out loud to anyone. Trevor got the benefit of the doubt. I got the audit. When he started his brokerage with a loan co-signed by my mother, using money that had originally been set aside, informally for both of us, nobody in the family used the word loan when they described it to me. They used the word investment in him, in his future, in the family name. When I asked, gently, whether there would ever be a similar investment made in anything I wanted to build, My mother told me I'd always been the responsible one, and responsible people, she said, didn't need as much help as the ones who took bigger risks. I filed that sentence away the same way I file everything, quietly, without comment, and went back to work. I have a son, his name is Eli. He's 5 years old, funny in a very serious way, the kind of kid who narrates his own breakfast like a nature documentary, who once informed me with total gravity that his cereal was, quote, going through a difficult transition. He was born with a kidney condition, a mild one, the kind his nephrologist described early on as watch and wait. For 3 years, watching and waiting was exactly what we did. Quarterly labs and ultrasound every 6 months, a life that looked from the outside completely ordinary. He rode a balance bike, he lost a tooth in a bowl of applesauce and cried more about the applesauce than the tooth. I let myself believe, the way you do when a scary thing has been quiet long enough, that maybe it was going to stay quiet forever. Then in February, at a routine scan that I almost rescheduled because I had a deadline at work, the nephrologist went quiet in that specific way doctors go quiet right before they hand you a different year than the one you were planning on living. Her name is Dr. Whitfield, and I remember she set her tablet down on the counter before she said anything, which in hindsight I understand was her giving herself a second to choose her words. She used the phrase function decline. She used the phrase likely transplant workup. Not tomorrow, she said, but soon, and I asked her in the flattest voice I could manage to define soon in actual months because I have never once in my life been able to sit inside a vague sentence when a specific one was available. 3 to 6 months, she told me, depending on the trend line. Eli sat on the exam table the entire time, swinging his feet, completely unaware that the 2 adults in the room were quietly rearranging the rest of his childhood around a word he wouldn't understand for years, and soon, in the body of a 5-year-old, has a way of turning into very large numbers very quickly, the kind of numbers that show up on hospital estimates with more zeros than you're prepared to see attached to your own child's name. I called my brother that same afternoon from the hospital parking garage because that's what you do. You call your family. I told him what the doctor said. I told him I was scared, and I remember my voice cracking on the word transplant in a way I hadn't let it crack in front of Dr. Whitfield. And Trevor, who runs a small commercial insurance brokerage and golfs with men who eventually become his clients, did not ask me how Eli was doing and did not ask me how I was holding up. He asked one question. Have you told Mom yet? I said not yet. I just left the appointment, and he said, almost too quickly, don't worry about it. I'll call her. You just focus on Eli. I remember feeling in that moment genuinely grateful. I want that on the record because it matters to how the rest of this unfolded. I thought my big brother was finally, for once in his life, stepping up to handle something so I wouldn't have to. I understand that question differently now than I did in the moment. In the moment, I thought it was concern. Looking back, it was a green light being requested, a starting gun, because by that Saturday, less than 48 hours later, without a single follow-up call to me, without asking my permission for anything, my son's photograph, hospital gown, a missing front tooth, an IV taped to the back of his small hand, was live on the internet asking strangers for money. It was a photo I recognized immediately, one I'd posted myself months earlier on a private family album, never intended for strangers, cropped now to show just enough of a hospital room in the background to do its work on anyone scrolling past it. My mother had shared it to every group chat, every church list, every corner of her digital life before I'd even finished my lunch that Saturday. My brother had registered a nonprofit, filed in under 72 hours, which even at the time struck me as an unusually fast turnaround for paperwork that typically takes weeks. The Eli Ashford Kidney Fund, Director, Trevor Ashford, Treasurer, Carol Ashford, Beneficiary, in name only, my son, who at that point had never even needed a single dollar spent because we hadn't even finished the transplant workup. hadn't even received a bill, hadn't even had time to sit with the diagnosis ourselves before it became a headline in 300 people's news feeds. I found out the fund existed the way you find out most things about my family now, secondhand from someone outside it. A coworker stopped by my desk Monday morning, squeezed my shoulder, and told me she'd already donated. She was so sorry to hear about Eli, and did I know the fund had already crossed $10,000 over the weekend. I sat very still at my desk after she walked away, running the timeline in my head. Diagnosis on Thursday, fund live by Saturday, $10,000 by Monday morning. Nobody had asked me a single question in between. Not what Eli needed, not what our insurance already covered, not even what hospital we were using. They hadn't needed any of that information to build the thing. They only needed the photograph. Here's what I want you to understand about the next 9 days, because I've thought about them 1,000 times since. The fund raised money fast, faster than I expected, faster than felt normal for a town our size. $12,000 in the first 2 days, $28,000 by day 5, $41,000 by day 9. And I did not feel relief watching that number climb, even though relief would have been the reasonable human response to strangers being generous toward my sick child. What I felt instead was a small, cold spot at the base of my neck, the exact spot where I feel it at work when an adjuster's file is too clean, when the math resolves a little too neatly, when somebody has clearly already decided what story they want the numbers to tell before they've finished collecting them. I asked Trevor in writing because 14 years of this job has taught me that people who have nothing to hide answer in writing, and people who do call you instead so there's no paper trail. I asked him to either transfer the fund to me as Eli's legal guardian or to route all disbursements directly to the hospital's billing office. I even attached the platform's own instructions for exactly that kind of transfer. A simple 2-step process. The kind of thing that takes a competent person about 10 minutes. He called within the hour instead of writing back. He told me there was a process. He told me I needed to trust the family. When I pushed, gently, asking what specifically the process involved, he got vague in a way I recognized from childhood. The same vagueness he used to deploy when our mother asked him where he'd been until 2 in the morning. "Just handle your part, Maya," he said. "Let me handle mine." I remember hanging up and sitting with the phone in my hand for a long moment, turning that sentence over, "Let me handle mine," from a man who had never once handled anything without somebody quietly cleaning up behind him. 3 days later, he handed me $2,000 in a parking lot in the form of an oversized novelty check, the cardboard kind with a giant printed dollar amount, while a photographer from his own brokerage office took pictures for the funds page. I stood there holding that ridiculous check while people walking to their cars slowed down to watch, and Trevor kept saying, "Smile, Maya, come on, smile," like we were at a ribbon cutting instead of standing in a Target parking lot with my son's medical crisis printed on cardboard between us. The caption when it posted said, "First support for our brave boy." I still have that photograph. If you look closely, I'm not smiling in it. I was doing arithmetic in my head, and even then, some part of me already knew the arithmetic wasn't going to add up. $2,000 out of what was by then closing in on 50,000 raised, handed over as though it were a generous gift and not a fraction of what my son's own name had brought in. The family group chat during those first few weeks was its own kind of education. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years suddenly had opinions about Eli's recovery timeline. Aunts posted prayer hands and heart emojis under every update Trevor pushed out, updates that were always heavy on adjectives and light on specifics, brave, warrior, blessed, and always, always a link back to the donation page. Nobody in that chat ever asked me directly how Eli was actually doing medically, what his labs showed, what the actual timeline for the transplant workup looked like. They asked Trevor's version of events, and Trevor's version of events was always, conveniently, the one that kept the number climbing. In between the parking lot check and the appointment where everything finally cracked open, there was a gala. I want to describe it to you the way it was described to me later, because I wasn't there myself. I was home with Eli that night while he ran a low fever from a cold, which in hindsight feels like its own quiet piece of evidence about where my priorities were and where everyone else's were. It was held in a hotel ballroom downtown, string lights, a step and repeat banner with Eli's face printed across it a dozen times in a row, the same cropped hospital photo now blown up to the size of a door. My mother wore a sash, an actual sash, powder blue, that read Team Eli in gold script, the kind of thing you'd order from a party supply website within about 4 clicks. Trevor gave a speech from a small podium, and near the end of it, he raised a glass and announced, to applause, that the Eli Ashford Kidney Fund was proud to pledge $15,000 to the hospital's pediatric nephrology unit in Eli's honor. 400 people, I was told, stood up and clapped. My mother pressed her hand to her chest like she was accepting a medal on my son's behalf. A month later, at one of Eli's actual follow-up appointments, the real kind, in a small exam room with fluorescent lighting and a laminated growth chart on the wall, a hospital social worker named Denise mentioned something to me carefully, the way people mention things they're not officially supposed to bring up yet. She was helping me sort through some billing paperwork when she said, almost as an aside, we never did receive anything from your family's event back in March. I asked her what she meant, and she chose her words the way you choose steps across a frozen pond. There had been an announcement, she said, a pledge, a fairly large one, made from the podium, to this very hospital in Eli's name. A colleague of hers in development had watched a clip of it. And in the week since, nothing had arrived. Not a check, not a wire, not so much as a follow-up email. I drove home 90 minutes with one number keeping time against the windshield wipers. $15,000 applauded into a microphone in front of 400 people and never actually sent anywhere except back into whatever account my brother controlled alone. I want to tell you honestly that up until that drive home, I had still been telling myself a fairly generous story about my family. Vain, maybe. Tacky, definitely, with the sash and the banner and my son's face the size of a door. But basically harmless, basically well-meaning people who just liked attention more than was strictly healthy. That drive home ended that version of the story for good. You don't accidentally forget to send $15,000 you promised out loud to a children's hospital in front of 400 witnesses. Forgetting requires a level of carelessness that doesn't exist next to that level of showmanship. What I was looking at wasn't neglect. It was a stage, and the applause had been the entire point, and the check had never once been real. That pledge is the thread I started pulling on, and I want to be honest with you. At the time, I had no idea it was attached to something as large as what it eventually became. I thought I was chasing a family member who'd gotten sloppy and a little greedy during a stressful season. I did not yet understand I was chasing a pattern with a history, one my brother had already gotten away with once before, quietly, somewhere else, to someone else. I went back to Denise the following week, not as a parent this time, but almost as a colleague, laying out dates and figures the way I would for any claim file at my own desk. And she looked at me for a long moment before she said quietly, most families in your position just let it go. The money's raised, the kid gets better, nobody wants to be the one who makes it complicated. I told her I understood exactly why most families let it go, and that I probably would have too, if I hadn't spent 14 years training myself out of the instinct to look away from a number that didn't add up. She nodded slowly, like she'd expected that answer, and slid a folder of her own across the desk, hospital correspondence about the pledge, dates, names, the paper trail from her side of it. I told me you'd probably want this eventually, she said. I didn't know eventually would be this soon. I did what 14 years of claims work trained me to do without even really deciding to do it. I built a file. I printed screenshots of every public post announcing a dollar figure. I printed the bank memo from the $2,000 transfer. I printed the novelty check photograph. I dated everything in the corner, the way I've done 1,000 times at my own desk for other people's disputes, never once imagining I'd be doing it for my own family. I labeled the folder plainly, the way I label everything, Eli-Fund. I did not know yet that folder would eventually need a second label. I requested a full accounting in writing, copying my mother, attaching the platform's own instructions for transferring a campaign to a beneficiary's guardian. It's a simple process. It takes minutes. What I received back instead was not an accounting. It was a summons disguised as a family dinner. My mother's dining room, no plates set out, which told me everything before a single word was spoken, because my mother has never once in her life called a meeting where food wasn't served unless the meeting itself was the point. Trevor was there. His wife, Rachel, sat with her hands folded in her lap and said almost nothing the entire evening, which I would later understand was not disinterest. It was grief she hadn't found the shape for yet. And in the center of the table, in front of the one empty chair clearly meant for me, sat a manila folder, squared perfectly, corners aligned, the way you square something when you want it to look official before anyone's read a word of it. My mother told me they were concerned about me. She used the phrase not thinking clearly, delivered the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis, calm, certain, unkind in its certainty. Not since the diagnosis, she said, as though my son's illness were the thing making me difficult rather than the thing being used against both of us. Then she nodded at the folder. Inside was a media release, granting the fund what the document called perpetual rights to Eli's name, his image, and his, quote, medical narrative in exchange for exactly nothing. Sign it, she said, and all of this unpleasantness ends. I did not sign it. I want that on the record, because there's a version of me in that dining room who almost did, who felt the old grooves of the house pulling at her hand, the same grooves that had me quietly circling numbers at 11 years old instead of crying about my father leaving. Trevor barely spoke during the whole meeting, which I noticed even then. He let our mother do the talking, the way he always has, the way the whole architecture of that house was built for him to do. When I finally asked him directly, across that empty table, where the $15,000 from the gala had actually gone, he looked at his wife instead of at me, just for a half second, and said, "It's earmarked, Maya. It's being managed properly, through something bigger than one hospital bill." I asked him what exactly was bigger than the actual child the money had supposedly been raised for. He didn't answer that question. He picked up his water glass instead, which I've come to understand after 14 years of reading people who don't want to answer questions, is its own kind of answer. I called him myself 2 nights later, alone, no witnesses, wanting one honest conversation between the two of us before this went any further, because some part of me still believed, even then, that there was a version of my brother who would tell me the truth if nobody else was in the room to perform for. He picked up on the 4th ring, sounding tired in a way that almost made me soften. I asked him plainly, no letters, no folders, just tell me where the gala money went. There was a long pause, long enough that I could hear a television somewhere behind him, and then he said, "You don't understand how this stuff works, Maya. There's overhead, there's reserve. You can't just hand 15 grand straight to a hospital. It doesn't work like that." I told him I actually did understand exactly how it worked, better than he did. It was my entire career, and that a pledge announced from a podium either gets paid or it's a lie told to 400 people with a microphone. He got quiet again, and then he said something I've turned over in my head many times since. "You've always made everything so complicated," he said. "It's not complicated, Trevor," I told him. "It's 5 numbers and a bank statement." He hung up before I finished the sentence, and that was the last real conversation the two of us had before everything that came after. My mother reached across the table at one point during that same dinner and put her hand over mine, the way she used to when I was small and upset about something she considered manageable. "Maya," she said, softer now, You have always been the strong one. Let your brother carry something for once." I sat with that sentence the entire drive home, turning it over. Let your brother carry something. As though what he was carrying was a burden, and not $60,000 of other people's money with his name as the only signature required to move it. But I put the pen down and I drove home. And that night I did the thing that changed this story from an ordinary family betrayal into something with an entirely different shape. I pulled the fund's public nonprofit filing from the state registry. It took less than 10 minutes to find what should have taken my brother's lawyer about 30 seconds to warn him against doing. He had listed his own brokerage's commercial address as the fund's registered office. He had listed himself as the sole authorized signer on the fund's bank account, meaning one person and one person only could move donor money anywhere he chose, with no second signature required, no oversight board, nothing. There was no treasurer's counter-signature line filled in anywhere, despite my mother's title. There was no independent board listed at all, just Trevor's name 3 times in 3 different fields, like a man filling out a form for an audience of exactly nobody. That's not carelessness. That's architecture. Somebody built that structure on purpose, and structures like that have very specific names in the federal statute books, names I did not know yet, but would learn in detail within the month. I sat with the filing open on my laptop for a long time that night. The house quiet. Eli asleep down the hall with his nightlight shaped like a dinosaur throwing a soft green glow across his doorframe. I thought about every conversation I'd ever had with my brother about money, going back years, the vague answers, the way he always changed the subject to something bigger, something coming, something that would make sense of all of it eventually if I would just trust him a little longer. I had spent my whole life reading that pattern as Trevor being Trevor, disorganized, a little slippery, but harmless. Looking at that filing, I understood for the first time that disorganized and harmless were words my family had trained me to use instead of the more accurate ones. 2 weeks after that, the second thread found me, and I want to be clear that I did not go looking for it. It came from someone inside Trevor's own office, forwarded anonymously, no name attached, just a single internal memo referencing what it called a prior administrative matter from 4 years earlier at a different brokerage Trevor had worked for before starting his own firm. A client trust account, a shortfall, quietly settled, never prosecuted, sealed under a non-disclosure agreement that had apparently, until that email landed in my inbox, held for 4 full years. I read that memo probably a dozen times that night, checking the date against what I remembered of Trevor's employment history, matching it against a gap of about 8 months on an old resume of his I still had saved from when I'd helped him format it once. Years earlier, back when helping him format things was still just an ordinary, unremarkable thing sisters did for brothers. My brother had done this before, smaller, once, and walked away from it completely clean, with nobody outside a small circle of lawyers ever knowing. I sat with that knowledge for 3 full days before I told a single other person, because once you know a thing like that about your own family, you cannot unknow it, and I needed to be sure, before I said it out loud to anyone, that I was prepared to live inside whatever came next. That is the moment this story stopped being about one difficult season with one difficult brother. That's the moment I understood I was not looking at a mistake made under pressure. I was looking at a pattern with exactly 0 consequences behind it so far, and a pattern that, left alone, was going to happen again to someone else's child, with an even cleaner cover story next time, because now he'd know precisely which threads not to leave loose. I want to be honest about something, because this whole story hinges on it, and I've thought a long time about how to say it. I had every legal option available to me at that point to simply walk away quiet. My mother offered me exactly that, standing on my own front porch the week before Eli's transplant workup officially began. She came without calling first, which she almost never does, and I remember thinking, watching her walk up the path, that she had rehearsed whatever she was about to say. She had an envelope in her hand, $12,000 in cash, she told me, counted out in hundreds, and then she said the sentence I'd heard my entire life dressed up in 100 different outfits. "This family runs on trust, Maya. Don't you dare turn my son, meaning my nephew, meaning Eli, into a headline." I asked her, standing there on my own porch with the evening going gold behind her, whether she had any idea what the actual fund balance was supposed to be versus what had actually been spent. She said that wasn't the point. I told her it was entirely the point, that it was the only point that had ever mattered in this whole thing, and that a mother who genuinely wanted to protect her grandson would be asking the same question I was asking instead of standing on a porch with an envelope of cash trying to make the question go away. She flinched at that, just slightly, the first crack I'd seen in her all spring. I looked at that envelope for a long time. I want you to understand what I was actually being offered in that moment, because it wasn't $12,000. It was permission to go back to being the daughter who handles things quietly. It was every year of my childhood, folded up and handed back to me on a porch in the evening light, one more time, disguised as a kindness. I pushed the envelope back into her hands. Not because I wanted revenge, and I need you to believe me on that, because revenge was never the engine here. I turned it down because I did the arithmetic my job has trained into me for 14 years, and the arithmetic came out very simple. If I took that money and stayed quiet, Trevor would do this again. Maybe not to my son next time, maybe to somebody else's, and he would do it with a cleaner story because I would have just personally taught him which threads to tuck away. So I called someone I should have called the very week I found the pledge that never arrived instead of a lawyer for a polite civil letter. Her name is Renata Cole. We worked together years ago on a large claims investigation before she moved over to fraud referrals for the U.S. Attorney's Office. She remembered me immediately when I called, which surprised me, and she cleared an hour on her calendar the following Tuesday without asking a single question over the phone beyond, "Bring everything you have, don't summarize it for me, let me read it myself." I laid the entire file out in front of her on a conference room table, the nonprofit filing with the sole signer structure circled in red, the bank statements, the phantom pledge documentation from the hospital, and 11 months of additional records that came from someone I hadn't expected. My sister-in-law, Rachel, who had been sitting silent at that dinner table with her hands folded, had apparently spent months quietly printing her own copies of the fund's bank activity from a shared office account, watching the same pattern I was watching, saying nothing to anyone. Until the week she finally handed me a folder of her own across a diner table and said only, "If you're going to use these, use them to do this right, not just to win." I asked her, that day in the diner, why now, after months of watching in silence the way I had? She stirred her coffee for a long moment before she answered. "Because I do the books for the office," she said. "Trevor can't run a spreadsheet to save his life. I've known for a while. I just didn't know what doing something about it was supposed to look like until I watched you start doing it." Renata was quiet for a long time after she finished reading, longer than I expected, flipping back through certain pages twice, making small notes in the margin of a legal pad. Then she took her glasses off, set them down, and said the sentence that changed the entire shape of everything that came after. "Maya, this isn't a civil misuse of funds complaint. This is wire fraud. You have interstate solicitation through the donation platform, a false public pledge made and never honored, a sole signer account structure that was clearly built to move donor money without any oversight, and now a documented prior pattern from 4 years ago that was quietly settled instead of prosecuted. If that pattern is real and it's documented the way you're telling me it's documented, that is not a coincidence a grand jury is going to be asked to look past." She walked me through, slowly and plainly, what a referral like this would actually involve. Months, she said, maybe longer. My own name attached to every filing. No guarantee, none at all, of how a grand jury would ultimately see it. I told her I understood. She looked at me for a moment and said, "Most people say that and don't actually understand it yet. Sit with it for a week before you sign anything." I did. My answer didn't change. I want to tell you what doing the right thing actually feels like in the moment, because nobody tells you the truth about it beforehand. It does not arrive dressed as courage. It arrives dressed as grief with paperwork attached to it. I signed a sworn affidavit. My own name, under the word true, notarized at 8:14 in the morning on a Tuesday, my hand steadier than I expected it to be, which surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire story. The notary was an older woman with reading glasses on a chain, and she stamped the page without ever once looking up to ask what any of it was about, which I found strangely comforting. The ordinariness of it, a routine Tuesday errand for her, the hinge of my entire family's history for me. There are signatures you can walk back later if you change your mind. I understood while the pen was still moving across the page that this was not going to be one of those. The waiting after that was its own particular kind of hard. Weeks passed with no word, and I went on living an entirely ordinary parallel life during those weeks, packing Eli's lunch, driving him to his labs, sitting through a birthday party at a trampoline park where I smiled and made small talk with other parents while a federal grand jury I couldn't discuss with anyone was somewhere in the process of reviewing a file with my brother's name on it. My mother called twice during that stretch, normal calls, asking about Eli's numbers, asking if I'd tried a new casserole recipe she'd seen online, and I answered her both times in an ordinary voice, because Renata had been very clear that I could not say a single word about what was happening, not to protect Trevor, but to protect the integrity of the process itself. It is a strange kind of loneliness, carrying something that large through conversations that small. 3 weeks after I signed the affidavit, Renata called me herself, not an assistant, not an email, her own voice on a Thursday morning telling me the grand jury had returned an indictment, 2 counts of wire fraud. There was a warrant. I was sitting in my car in a hospital parking garage when she told me. The exact same garage where months earlier I'd called my mother from that same stretch of concrete to tell her Eli was sick, and I felt 2 entirely separate truths land on me at the exact same moment. The way they always seem to land together in this family, one right on top of the other. My son was 2 days past his transplant workup, stable, recovering, everything he needed finally, fully funded through the hospital's own patient assistance program with no family money anywhere near it anymore. And my brother was about to be arrested. I sat in that car for probably 20 minutes after we hung up, not crying exactly, just breathing, the way you breathe after you've been holding something heavy for so long, your arms have forgotten what it feels like to be empty. I want to be precise about what happened next, because it's the part every version of a story like this usually skips past on its way to a tidy ending. Trevor was not quietly encouraged to dissolve his foundation and slip out of public view the way these things sometimes go. He was walked out of his own brokerage office in handcuffs on a Thursday morning by 2 federal agents, in front of the same colleagues who had once smiled for that novelty check photograph. A former client of his, I learned much later, happened to be in the lobby at the time and posted about it before the agents had even pulled out of the parking lot, which is its own strange commentary on how fast a carefully built name can come apart once nobody is left to manage the narrative. There was no carefully worded press release drafted to soften the landing this time. There was a docket number, there was a mugshot that made the local paper, and then, within a day, several papers beyond it, the story picked up by outlets in 3 other states, each one running some version of the same headline: family fundraiser, sick child, felony charges. I did not read the comment sections. Rachel told me later I was right not to. There was, for the first time in my entire life, a consequence in my family that nobody was able to manage, or stage, or explain away over Sunday dinner. My mother called me that same afternoon. Not the church lady voice she uses for condolence cards and casserole deliveries. Not the "this family runs on its name" voice I'd heard my entire life. A smaller voice, one I had genuinely never heard come out of her before in 36 years. "What did you do?" she said. And it wasn't even phrased as a question. It was an accusation shaped like grief. The way grief in my family has always come dressed up as blame instead of sorrow. I let the silence sit for a second before I answered, because I had promised myself, somewhere in the middle of all this, that I would stop rushing to fill silences that weren't mine to fill. I told her the truth, because somewhere along this whole road I had promised myself I would, no matter how it landed on the other end of the line. I didn't do anything to Trevor, Mom. Trevor did this to Trevor. I just stopped being the only one in this family who knew. She didn't respond to that. I heard her breathing on the other end of the line for a few seconds, and then the call ended. No goodbye, just the small click of a woman who had run out, for the first time I could remember, of a script. Here's the accounting, because if you've stayed with me this long, you've earned the actual numbers, and I promised myself at the start of all this that I would always give people the real numbers instead of the version that sounds better. The fund's remaining balance, just over $60,000, was frozen the moment the investigation became public, and once the indictment was formally announced, that balance was transferred by court order directly to the hospital's own patient assistance fund. The same fund that had already quietly been covering Eli's transplant workup while the criminal case was building in the background. Every single donor received a written notice explaining exactly where their money had actually ended up. A hospital account, audited, applied straight to patient care, not a kitchen renovation, not a truck payment, not a golf membership, the way it might have if nobody had ever pulled that first thread. The plea hearing was on a Tuesday in March, almost exactly a year after that first phone call from the hospital parking garage. I sat in the second row of a courtroom that smelled faintly of floor wax, with Rachel beside me, both of us there without our mother, who did not attend, though she later told me she'd sat in her car in the courthouse parking lot the entire time, unable to make herself go in. Trevor pled guilty 8 months after the indictment to one count in exchange for the second being dropped. I watched him stand at that podium in a suit that no longer fit him quite the way it used to, his lawyer beside him, and I felt none of the satisfaction I had halfway expected to feel. I felt something closer to the exhaustion you feel after finally setting down something heavy you've been carrying for much longer than you realized. The judge handed down restitution, 5 years of probation, and a lifetime bar on ever serving as an officer or director of any nonprofit organization in the state. I did not expect to feel anything about that last part, the nonprofit bar, but I did, standing in that courtroom hallway afterward, watching Trevor sign the paperwork with a court-appointed pen instead of the expensive one he always used to carry in his jacket pocket. It felt like the first sentence anyone in law enforcement had ever handed my family that couldn't be quietly reframed into something more flattering later, at a dinner table, in front of people who didn't know better. There would be no toast to it, no sash, no podium, just a docket number that would follow him for the rest of his professional life, whether anyone chose to bring it up at Thanksgiving or not. My mother sold the house not long after, the house she had never once offered to sell when it was Eli's surgery that needed funding, and used part of the proceeds to help cover what the restitution order didn't reach. I drove past it once, a few months after the sale, and saw a different family swing set already up in the backyard, and felt strangely little about it, less than I expected to. She has not apologized to me. Not once, not in any of the ways I used to imagine an apology from her might sound, the ones I used to rehearse in my head during long drives, the ones where she finally said the sentence I'd been waiting 36 years to hear. But she has twice now called and asked about Eli's kidney function numbers in a voice that sounds almost like the woman I remember from before all of this, before the sash, before the podium, before any of it, and I answer her plainly, the way I answer everyone now. That's as far as the bridge goes between us at the moment, and I have finally, after 36 years, stopped pretending it needs to go any further than that in order for me to be at peace with it. Rachel and Trevor are divorced now. She kept her maiden name through the whole process, which I don't think was an accident. She and I are close in a way we never quite managed to be while she was married to my brother, closer maybe than sisters who share actual blood sometimes get to be, because there's a particular kind of bond that forms between two people who watch the same slow motion collapse from two different rooms and came out the other side willing to tell each other the truth about what they saw. She brings her kids over most Sundays now. Denise, the social worker from the hospital, still texts me every few months to check on Eli's numbers, long after her job required her to. Renata and I get coffee occasionally, though we're careful never to talk about the case itself once it's closed, some professional habit neither of us has managed to shake. Eli's transplant is scheduled for the fall. His numbers are good. His nephrologist used the word encouraging at our last visit, which from her is practically a celebration. He doesn't know most of what I've told you tonight, and he won't. Not for a long time, not until he's old enough to hold it the way it actually needs to be held. Someday I'll give him the short version. That his family once tried to build something out of his illness, and that his mother made sure the thing they built ended up in a courtroom instead of quietly getting away with it the way it always had before, every single time for as long as anyone in this family could remember. I still audit claims for a living. I still find the sentence on page 1 that doesn't match the sentence on page 3. Some days I think about how strange it is that the exact skill nobody in my family ever valued in me, the quiet, unglamorous ability to notice when two versions of the truth don't line up, turned out to be the only thing standing between my brother and a third round of the same crime against a third family who wouldn't have had anyone like me in the room to catch it in time. I used to think that skill made me useful to people. Now I understand it made me eventually unmanageable to the ones who needed me to stay quiet, and I've made a kind of peace with which one of those two things I'd rather be. We have Sunday dinners at my house now, the good kind. The kind that just quietly became a habit instead of an event anyone had to announce. Rachel brings her kids. Denise stops by when her shift allows it. Eli sets the table himself now, very seriously, narrating the whole process the way he narrates everything, and last week he counted the chairs out loud before we sat down and announced with total satisfaction that everybody came. Nobody at that table shares my blood except Eli, and every single person at it showed up on purpose, which I've come to understand is its own kind of family, maybe the only kind that was ever actually worth having. That's my story. One pledge that never arrived at a hospital that needed it. One sealed matter from 4 years earlier that was never supposed to see daylight again. And one indictment that finally made the words this family runs on its name mean something true for the very first time on the day it actually cost my brother something real instead of costing me my silence. If you've ever been the only person in your family willing to make the hard call, put the word present in the comments below, because I read every single one of them, and I promise you, you are not the only one. And if this is the story that finally gives somebody the permission they've been waiting for to stop protecting the person who's hurting them, please share it with them tonight. Subscribe to Calm Drama Stories, and I will see you in the next one.